Okay, I guess we'll get started as people are joining us in the room. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patricia Aaliyah. I'm from Aaliyah Associates. Thanks for joining us today at the CondoWise Learning Series. And we're doing part 3 today on the dark side of condos. We're going to be talking about cyber fraud in condos. And we started talking about cyber fraud when we were preparing for this. And we realized actually it's cyber crime in condos. So we're going to cover more than what we anticipated. A CondoWise learning session, as you know, is free and open to the public. Please share with your colleagues and know that this is being recorded. It'll be available through our website and YouTube channel. If your fellow board members or property management colleagues aren't able to attend. All of the advice is free and it's not legal advice at this point. We suggest you speak to your legal counsel to ensure that the advice is appropriate for your condominium, since each condominium is unique. Next slide, please. Today, I have with me Julia White, Ashley Winberg, and Shannon Penny from our team at Aaliyah Associates to help us unlock and understand this darker side of condos. Next slide, please. We also have a special guest, Jordan Chesney, who's the Executive Vice President of A&R Solutions, is going to be joining us a little bit later on in the webinar. And he is going to bring some practical perspectives. What's interesting about Jordan is that this is his full-time job in terms of managing technology solutions, but he also happens to be a condo director as well. So condo directors are everywhere, which is great. So we'll get some insights from him a little bit later on. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon from our team to give you a condo news update on some key important issues. Shannon?
Perfect. Thanks very much, Patricia. So most, if not all of us, have noticed that items are becoming more and more expensive. And unfortunately, this looks like our new reality. So condominiums have to prepare for their yearly budgets based on current inflation rates. And the same goes for reserve fund contributions. So reserve fund studies may need to be revisited to consider the current inflation rates. And what may have been a reasonable contribution last year may not be the case today. A large number of special assessments are anticipated as condominium corporations update their reserve fund studies to adjust for inflation. A condominium's engineer may have to update reserve fund studies in order to reflect the new reality of costs. With the shortage of labor comes an increase in the cost of labor. The looming hit for some condo owners reflects the confluence of escalating construction costs for materials, labor, and contractual or financial penalties tied to delayed delivery. On one side, contractors and project managers are encountering daunting constraints on the supplies and services needed to keep projects moving. On the other hand, they're beholden to developers and clients with budgets and timelines that are not sympathetic to supply chain difficulties. The lingering disruptions of COVID-19 combined with the repercussions from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is creating new complications and further inflation. This new reality might affect almost every aspect of the operating expense, and board members and management companies should explore all possibilities of reducing and controlling these costs on the common element fees. So moving on to the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. The troubling statistic that transportation accounts for 25% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in Canada has influenced the Government of Canada to believe that electrification is crucial to decarbonising the transportation industry and transitioning to a low carbon future. In an attempt to tackle this initiative, Natural Resources Canada has implemented the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is a federally funded program aimed at making electronic vehicle charging more accessible across Canada. Natural Resources Canada is now accepting proposals for the latest round of the funding. This round of requests for proposals focuses on public places, on-street parking, multi-unit residential buildings, workplaces, and vehicle fleets. And this will be open until August 11th, 2022. If you would like more information on the program, I'll put a link in the chat to a recent article that was published on our website that goes into further detail. Moving on April 11th, Ontario's new Working for Workers Act 2021 received royal assent, which introduced many employee-friendly changes to the Employment Standards Act. The Minister of Labour declared that the changes would require most workplaces to have a right to disconnect policy. The government's statements could understandably make an employer and condo directors, owners, and residents worry that their employees or service providers, including property management, were about to become unreachable outside of their scheduled work hours. However, the new rules do not actually give employees a right to disconnect. In fact, they don't give employees any new rights to refuse to work or ignore any work communications. Instead, the new rules require some employers to simply have a written policy in place for all employees with respect to disconnecting from work. This new rule does not apply to small businesses. An employer is only required to have a disconnection policy if it has 25 or more employees as of the first day of each calendar year. Finally, unfortunately, Ontario's top doctor has now confirmed that the province has entered its 7th wave of COVID-19, driven this time by the Omicron BA.5 subvariant. For the first time since May, test positivity is above 10%, with wastewater signals rising across the province. Ontario is also seeing its first increase in COVID-19 hospitalizations since May, with the number of people admitted for the virus higher than any time last summer. The BA.5 subvariant has been rising slowly since early June, but started to rise mid-month, becoming a dominant strain. Ontario can likely expect another 4 to 5 weeks in this wave, which is now in its 3rd week, and infections are expected to increase over the next 10 days before beginning to slow down. The new wave comes amid the summer months when many are spending more times outdoors, something that would have otherwise been expected to help curb the spread of transmission, raising questions as to what will happen as people head indoors later in the year. The province has confirmed that it is preparing for an influx of cases and is now reviewing further eligibility for booster doses, and a decision on that will be coming soon. At this time, there have been no changes to any mask restrictions. However, individuals can continue wearing a mask should they wish to do so, and condominiums can continue to pass and enforce their own rules that would require individuals to wear a mask and/or a face covering while on the indoor common elements. So I will now pass you over to Patricia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shannon, for the update. Lots of important topics there. And ladies and gentlemen, CCI is also in Huronia, I know, is going to be addressing some of those topics in the fall. We have some polls for you. The first one is, are you concerned about your condominium or organization being a victim of cybercrime? I'm curious to know where people's thinking is in terms of being aware about cybercrime. And I see 67% are not worried about cybercrime. Oh, yeah. Okay. So 86% are not, or 67 are. Seems like a majority are not worried about it. Hopefully we'll change your mind at the end of this one today. Next poll, please. So the next one is, has your condominium organization been a victim of cybercrime, either directly or indirectly? No, yes. So we have some who don't know. Majority have not been affected by it, which is great. And some have been. That's interesting. Those might be the people who are concerned about cybercrime. Next poll for you is, has your condominium or organization taken steps to reduce its exposure to cybercrime? Okay, so no or don't know. Oh, and some have taken some steps, which is great to know. Okay, so we're a little bit all over, but majority are not really concerned. A majority don't, haven't taken steps to implement that. So where we're going to go now And through the presentation, we're going to first define and help you understand what we mean when we talk about cybercrime, because part of this is about awareness. And then we're going to apply that to condos to show you where the risk exists in your condo. And then we're going to talk about some solutions. And then hopefully Jordan will join us by that time as well to share some practical technology solutions. So I'm going to turn this over to Ashley Winberg, whom you all know, and she's going to explain to us what is cybercrime. Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So incidents of cybercrime are becoming more and more prevalent and very disruptive throughout Ontario, and there have been several incidents affecting the condominium industry in Ontario alone within recent years. And this is because larger organizations and businesses, generally their defenses are not as sophisticated as a large bank or a nationwide company. So their servers are much easier to penetrate, making them a softer target. So what is cybercrime? Well, cybercrime, one form of cybercrime could be a data breach. A data breach is an incident that exposes, sorry, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. A data breach is an incident that exposes confidential or personal information. It could involve the loss of one's banking or credit card information, personal healthcare information, passwords or email addresses. And as we'll discuss today, it can be accidental or intentional. So an accidental example of a data breach would be an employee of a company accidentally leaving a laptop on the subway, and the laptop contains sensitive and confidential information, as well as automatic access to certain servers, or someone accidentally releasing or disclosing someone's personal information in error, not knowing that it was supposed to be kept confidential. Or unfortunately, we have seen some condominiums that have been the victim of a cyber fraud incident where they've received an email, it looks legitimate, they've clicked on the link, and then all of a sudden, the perpetrators have duped them into transferring funds to an account that's not what they thought it was. Or sometimes hackers can hack into the email address and then send false invoices requesting payment, and sometimes people don't know, they look legitimate, and they just transfer over the money. Now, what we've seen more and more, unfortunately, is more intentional incidences of data breaches. So an intentional incident of a data breach, I mean, someone could maliciously disclose confidential or personal information, but more often it's the result of ransomware. So ransomware is a type of malware, a malicious software, and it can be used to essentially hack and access a victim's network. So their server, their network, their data, and then the perpetrator can then steal the confidential information or data to, commit fraud or steal someone's identity, so on and so forth. However, unfortunately, we have come across incidences of ransomware attacks whereby the perpetrator uses the malicious software to gain access into the victim's network. They're there for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, just monitoring things, and then all of a sudden they pursue the attack. The entire system is locked and essentially held hostage until the victim pays the ransom demanded. So what happens is the essentially hacker or the perpetrator encrypts the entire network, locking up the entire server in the system and data. And then often a ransom is negotiated, and then once the ransom is paid, if it is paid, the hacker or perpetrator then provides an encryption key to unlock the server and the network. Hopefully that actually worked, but sometimes they unfortunately do not work. So that is an incident, an example sort of ransomware, and it can be very costly, as we'll discuss, and very disruptive. I'll now turn it over to Julia. Julia?
Thanks, Ashley. Sorry, can we just go to the next slide, please? Okay, so next we're going to be talking about why condos and their service providers could be susceptible to cybercrime. So condos have an obligation to collect, use, and disclose personal information from owners and residents when required to fulfill the objects and duties of the condo, and are only to use this information for purposes under the Condominium Act. The Act specifically sets out the type of information that condos must or can collect, use, and disclose, for what stated purpose, and for how long the information must be retained. So what data or information does the condo have to keep? Condos are required to keep certain records in accordance with Section 55 of the Act. Some of these include financial records, minutes of owners and board meeting minutes, a list of the names of the owners of each unit and their address for service, instruments appointing a proxy or ballots for an owner's meeting that are submitted at a meeting, as well as other records either required by the condo's bylaws or that are specified under the general regulation under the Act. Also under Section 83 of the Act, where an owner leases their unit, they are required to provide to the condo the name of the individual who's leasing their unit and a copy of the lease, and the condo must maintain a record of this information. So what data and information is in the condo's control? In addition to the records that the condo is required to keep under Section 55 of the Act and Section 83 relating to leases, condos will also be in control of things like authorized payment and banking information for unit owners and the corporation's banking information, both of which are generally provided to property management. Condos will also have personal information relating to agents and staff of the corporation, sensitive health information of owners, residents, agents, and staff, caregiver information, and so on. As well, there might be a locker registry or parking registry, which would show who has access to each locker and parking space, and potentially the make and model of the vehicle parked in such parking spaces, as well as phone numbers and email addresses of owners and residents where they've been provided to the condo. So any of this information or documentation that a condo is required to keep would be susceptible to compromise in the event of a cybersecurity incident. So this is why it's important to take steps to protect that information. So the Personal Information and Electronic Documents Act, also known as PIPEDA, this is Canada's privacy legislation. The objective is to establish parameters to govern the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information by private sector organizations. So the question is whether PIPEDA actually applies to condos. Arguably, it doesn't directly apply to condos because they're nonprofit organizations and therefore don't engage in commercial activities. However, PIPEDA does apply to organizations that serve condos. So property management or security staff acting on behalf of or for the condo and who are responsible for the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information are organizations to which PIPEDA would apply. So what is the standard? Under PIPEDA, personal information includes any factual or subjective information, recorded or not, about an identifiable individual. This includes information in any form, such as an individual's age and name. Also under PIPEDA, certain security safeguards are to be put in place to ensure that personal information is protected. And Shannon is going to be speaking about this a little bit later on. As I've mentioned, PIPEDA doesn't explicitly apply to condos outside of its service providers and agents, but a condo's obligations under Section 55 of the Act to manage information are very similar to the threshold that's established under PIPEDA. So under the Act, condos are required to keep records for a specific length of time, and depending on the record, it will differ. For example, financial records must be retained for a period of 6 years. The Act and the regulations also stipulate the method of retention for records. This could be in like a paper copy, or it could be electronic records. Electronic records are to be kept on a system or device that is capable of reproducing the required information in an accurate and intelligible form. This system also must include a password or other reasonable method of protecting against unauthorized access. and it must automatically back up files and allow for recovery of backed up files. So the most important of these in relation to cybercrime would be the protection of data from unauthorized access. Section 55 of the Act also establishes the basic obligations of condos with respect to records, specifically which records must be kept and made accessible to owners. So this is disclosure, and which records and information are subject to confidentiality and therefore are not to be disclosed to owners or outside parties. Records which owners are permitted access to and are to be provided in accordance with the procedure set out under the Act and the regulations, whereby a formal request for records is to be submitted by an owner. So Section 55(4) of the Act also provides that there is to be no disclosure of private or confidential records or materials relating to one, employees of the corporation other than employment contracts, two, actual or contemplated litigation or insurance investigations involving the corporation, and three, specific units or owners, except where the requesting party has a permitted interest in such unit. And additional records which are not to be disclosed, as well as exceptions, are set out under the regulations under the Act. So the last point is an information management and privacy policy. All condos should have one of these policies in place. Condos have an obligation under the Occupiers Liability Act to take reasonable steps to protect persons on its common elements from foreseeable harm. And under Section 26 of the Act, the condo is deemed to be the occupier of common elements for liability purposes. Condos also have an obligation under Section 117 of the Act to ensure that no condition exists or activity is conducted on the property that's likely to cause injury to an individual. An information management and privacy policy will confirm the obligations of the condo under the Act and other applicable legislation with respect to the collection, use, and disclosure of sensitive information, with the purpose being to inform owners and other individuals of such obligations. So it will advise those individuals of the nature and extent of the information that's being collected from them, the purpose for which that information is to be used, where the information will be stored, who it will be shared with, and when and how it will be destroyed. So this helps to create both transparency and accountability. A little bit later on, Patricia will be talking about the ways that condos can manage the risks of cybercrime, so outside of this policy. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley to talk about the consequences of cybercrime.
So as I mentioned, cybercrime is very prevalent. We hear about it on the news all the time, and we are all aware of how cybercrime can affect ordinary individuals. It poses a risk of monetary loss, identity theft, and it's also a hassle. You have to go and change various passwords, monitor particular accounts, change government identification. It's a hassle for individuals. It's also a hassle for the condominium industry service providers, any organizations, and condominiums themselves. It's really, cyber incidents can result not only in financial losses and potential fines, a reputational loss, and regulatory and litigation risk. But based upon our experience with the matter, the greatest impact that I see is the operational disruption, and it is often underestimated. Being subjected to a ransomware attack puts everything on hold. And for a company that is a small to mid-size business that is serving several condominiums throughout Ontario or other organizations, that can be devastating. It can be devastating not only for the company itself, but also for all of its clients. So a ransomware is not as simple as just holding over the money. As Shannon's going to discuss in greater detail, when a ransomware attack occurs, you're engaging forensic team immediately. There's a negotiation process, an attempted recovery, and even if the ransom is paid and an encryption key is provided, there's no guarantee that the data will actually be recovered. And so it can take several weeks for that all to occur and several weeks thereafter for the system to be back up and running and restored. Also, there is a loss of trust. We see this with the bigger banks in particular. there's a loss of trust and there's reputational damage. A lot of clients place a great deal of trust in the companies that they provide their confidential information to, like any personal health information or the details of their bank accounts for pre-authorized payments. And so when a company is either subjected and is a victim of a ransomware attack or fails to properly have the necessary safeguards in place to ensure that there are no accidental privacy breaches, data breaches, and to ensure that if they are a victim of a ransomware attack, that they manage it in the most effective and professional manner, their reputation and the trust that they develop with their clients over a number of years can be significantly impacted. And that in turn can result in an additional financial loss aside from the financial losses associated with the disruption in business, having to hire the forensic team, all the IT aspect of it, as well as legal, and potentially any fines. With respect to fines, on June 16th of this year, the House of Commons introduced a new bill. They introduced two, but the bill I'll be talking about is Bill C-27. So if this bill becomes law, which it is anticipated that it will, not in the immediate near future, but it is anticipated that it will introduce a bold new regime of privacy laws that will significantly affect all Canadian businesses. So this bill in particular will repeal Part 1 of the PIPEDA, which Julia discussed, the federal privacy law that applies to private companies throughout Canada. And it's going to expand the Federal Privacy Commissioner's enforcement powers. It's also going to create a tribunal, somewhat similar to the Condo tribunal that was created a few years ago. And it's going to allow individuals to have a private right of action when they are affected by an act or omission of an organization, if the organization contravened the requirements of the new legislation. So the new legislation will be creating a new Consumer Privacy Protection Act, and that's where all these new changes will be introduced under. And so this new act will allow individuals to have a private right of action against any company or organization that did not have sufficient safeguards in place to protect their personal information, or a company that has otherwise contravened the provisions of the new legislation, and it has impacted them. And what I'd like to discuss the most is the heavy fines that this tribunal will be able to impose. So this new tribunal will be able to impose administrative fines for any organizations that fail to comply with the new Consumer Privacy Protection Act, with its provisions. It can assign fines that are up to the greater of $10 million or 3% of an organization's gross revenue in the fiscal year before the penalty was imposed. So it's going to force a large number of Canadian businesses to significantly invest in the protection of their clients' personal information, as well as their own network, to ensure that it is protected from cyber criminals. Otherwise, they could face very heavy administrative penalties. Can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So now that we've discussed why cybercrime is a real thing for condominiums in Ontario and their service providers. This includes property management companies, accounting firms, lawyers, engineers. Cybercrime does not discriminate. It will target anyone, and it can. We are now going to discuss what to do if your company or organization has been the victim of a cybercrime incident. And Shannon will be presenting that. And then Patricia will be presenting, along with our special guest, how corporations and organizations can reduce their cybercrime risk exposure. I'll turn it over to Shannon now. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. If you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So an organization such as property management has a responsibility to protect personal information in a way that is appropriate to how sensitive the personal information is, and must protect all personal information from being compromised. The Information and Privacy Commissioner strongly recommends that corporations develop a privacy breach protocol. Boards and property managers must take immediate action upon learning of a privacy breach, and the steps on the screen may need to be carried out as soon as possible in the event of a privacy breach. So step 1, implementing a data breach protocol. So first, condo boards and property managers must notify all relevant staff of the breach and determine who else from within the organisation should be involved in addressing the breach. Condo boards and property managers should then work together to develop and execute a plan designed to contain the breach and notify those affected. If you have cyber insurance coverage, which is definitely recommended, as soon as you suspect a breach of the data within your custody, care or control, it is recommended that you notify your insurance provider. This early notification will allow your insurance provider to develop a plan to investigate the technical components of the breach, come up with a suitable response plan, and get the right resources in place to identify the extent and the scope of any data compromise. So step 2, notifying the commissioner if required. So organizations may be required to report the privacy commissioner any breach of security safeguards involving personal information under its control if it is reasonable to believe that the breach creates a real risk of significant harm to individuals. Boards and property managers will need to assess the breach and determine if a report to the Federal Privacy Commissioner is required, and if so, this must be done using the prescribed form. The issue of control should be considered, in particular where an organisation has collected, used or disclosed personal information and transferred this to a third party, and a breach has occurred while the third party was in possession of that personal information. We should ask ourselves who has control of this data. So Papada's accountability principle provides that an organisation remains responsible for the personal information it has transferred to a third party. Thus, the obligation to report the breach rests with the organisation who initially collected, used or disclosed the personal information, as the organisation would be deemed to have control of that information that was implicated by the breach. So step 3. Condo boards and managers must identify the scope of the breach and take any necessary steps to contain, including retrieving and securing any personal information that has been compromised, ensuring that no copies of the personal information has been made or retained by the individual who was not authorized to retrieve that information, and determine whether the privacy breach would allow unauthorized access to any other personal information, and take the necessary steps such as changing passwords, identification numbers, and or temporarily shutting down your system. So step 4, notifying any individuals affected by the breach. So organizations are required to notify all affected individuals of any breach of security safeguards involving the individual's personal information under its control. Again, if it's reasonable to believe that the breach creates a real risk of significant harm to that individual. Papada requires that the notification be given as soon as feasible after the organisation has determined that a breach has occurred, and the notification must include enough information to allow the individual to understand the significance of the breach and take necessary steps to reduce the risk of harm that could result from the breach. So step 5, investigation. So the condo boards and property managers will be expected to conduct an internal investigation, including ensuring that immediate requirements of containment and notification have been met, reviewing the circumstances surrounding the breach, reviewing the advocacy of existing policies and procedures in protecting personal information, and making any necessary amendments with legal counsel. Finally, ensuring that all staff are appropriately educated and trained with respect to compliance with all privacy protection provisions of all applicable legislation. And finally, step 6, condominium boards and property management companies should keep a record of all data breaches and all records of any notifications sent regarding those breaches. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in the event of a ransomware attack where an attacker demands payment after compromising your network and have obtained access and encrypted personal information, the steps on the screen may be needed to carry out as soon as possible. So step 1, condo boards and management should engage the relevant professionals and follow any data breach protocol that it has in place. You should also contact your cyber insurance provider, a data privacy attorney, and a digital forensics firm. Organizations that use the internet for use, collection, and disclosure of sensitive information are exposed to risk. In the condominium industry, where financial information, personal information, or data is collected, used, or disclosed electronically via the internet, an organization should consider taking out cyber insurance that provides coverage for those cyber risks. This can include coverage for forensic investigation expenses, including the cost of hiring a breach response firm and the cost of a professional negotiator and potential ransom payments to the organization that is extorting you. So step 2, you should exhaust all avenues in an attempt to recover any compromised data. However, given the complexity that comes with many ransomware attacks, it is recommended that professionals be retained to assist you on your behalf. It's also recommended that you back up your data frequently to ensure that in an event, if you are a victim of ransomware attack, you can gain quick access to the personal data that's backed up on a separate system. So step 3, negotiation of a ransom payment. With assistance from forensics and a negotiator, negotiations can begin with the attackers to negotiate the ransom down and secure proof of life, meaning that the attacker provide evidence that they will be able to reverse the encryption. When a business suffers a ransomware attack, it may have to decide whether to pay the ransom demand. And this can be a very difficult decision, and as not all businesses and not all ransomware attacks are the same. The decision should be made with the guidance of competent professionals who have expertise responding to ransomware attacks, such as legal counsel or data forensic experts. In many circumstances, the cost to engage these professionals will be covered under a cyber insurance policy. In deciding whether to pay a ransom, some important considerations can include: can the business recover its systems and data without paying the ransom? Would payment of the ransom reduce the overall cost of recovery? Or if the ransom is paid, will the criminals provide the keys to decrypt the data? In addressing this last question, it's especially important for a business to seek guidance from competent professionals. Not all ransomware attackers will provide decryption keys after ransom payment. Some will demand additional payment, or some may simply refuse. So a data forensic expert that facilitates ransomware responses on a frequent basis can help evaluate whether payment of the ransom will be worth the cost, or whether it's just an opportunity for the attacker to victimize the business again. So the agreements that happen, the organizations and attackers may include provide details, instructions, and technical support if we have problems. It can provide detailed proof of any downloaded data, provide confirmation that all access data has been deleted. It should never publish any data now or in the future, and the attacker must also agree to never attack the organization or its clients again. If the attackers are cooperating, you may be able to also request that they provide a detailed explanation of how it gained access to the network that will prevent this happening again. And upon agreement, the attackers will then provide a decryption key. So step 4 is the decryption process. So this process is slow, and most of the victim's data is restored after a week. However, the recovery efforts can also continue for well over a month. And step 5, an identity theft and credit monitoring services should be made available to individuals whose personal data was stored on one of the victim's servers. So I'll now pass you over to Patricia, who will be able to outline some proactive solutions to cybercrime. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. Welcome, Jordan. Good to see you. And we're going to talk about being proactive because, once the horse is out of the barn, it's kind of, you're doing your best to do damage control. So in terms of being proactive, we've given you hints throughout the presentation of where we can actually try to be proactive with our condos. First is creating and implementing an information management and privacy policy. So understanding your responsibility, the scope of the risk, and identifying the information that is within the corporation's care and control. As Shannon has indicated, even if you pass it on to an agent of the corporation, you're still going to be the party that's ultimately responsible. And why have a policy? To create a corporate governance format on how you're going to deal with certain issues, including, which I'm going to talk a little bit later about, contractual protection. Also, obtaining and maintaining adequate cyber insurance coverage. This is something very special and unique. Condo corporation insurance policies should be covering this now. And I've been talking to people at Atrin to see, where they are in this cycle. And, they are looking at it more closely to ensure that there's a degree of coverage, but there are different types of coverage. There can be coverage for ransomware, for negotiation, for the actual amount of the ransom. So you want to go a little bit deeper here to make sure what is the degree of exposure to the corporation? What is the level of coverage? Also, attaining an independent security assessment. Somebody who understands how your systems work or those of your service provider can provide some insight to the corporation and the board. Cybersecurity awareness training. This is important from everything from email use and not opening dangerous emails, because think about the operational behaviors of property managers, your teams on the ground, and what can come across their desk. Multi-factor authentication has come up, and we have had circumstances that we know of where people have transferred funds with good intentions to invest monies electronically, but there were no multi-factor authentication components, which arguably may have been red flags in the process. And so being more aware of how things are done electronically to secure access is important. Testing backup and recovery systems. This proved actually very helpful for one property management company that was actually negatively impacted by a ransomware event. They had outsourced the storage of data, and they did keep backups. So when they were hit with the ransomware event, they actually refused to pay and they were able to use their backup. So lesson learned that they were not being redundant, they were actually being proactive and helpful. So contractual protection. This is something you need to think about in all your service provider contracts. And you're going to be, expecting that not just the contractor, but any subcontractor in the chain meets those standards. And it's not just going to be complying with applicable laws. It's going to become more specific now. You want to know that the necessary insurance is being held as well by your providers. Requesting security certifications from IT service providers. And Jordan maybe can also touch a little bit on that because that's his area of part of expertise. And as I've mentioned as well, ensuring adequate cyber insurance coverage. Now, I want to cut my remarks a little bit short here because we were able to get Jordan at the last minute to come in and talk about solutions. And Jordan is the Executive Vice President, A&R Solutions, a company that does business across the country and implements technology solutions for a multitude of clients. But Jordan also has a unique feature is that he's also a condo director and gives of his time to support his community. So Jordan, welcome. And what can you share with us that we can help condo communities in terms of managing cybercrime?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. And thank you for having me on the session today. It's a great topic. It's one that I could probably spend all day talking about. So I'll do my very best to shorten this down to a 10-minute window. But from an IT provider's perspective, there's the reactive and the proactive approach to cybercrime prevention. So, I mean, the reality is sometimes we are faced with having to deal with the reactive methods because things do happen out there, and a lot of times from an IT provider's perspective, we're going into a situation where there's already a crisis in place. So, step one, if a crisis is to occur on the cyber front, definitely speak to the property manager, retain an IT MSP firm, a managed service provider firm, to come in and assess the crisis at hand, dissect the environment that's being dealt with, and kind of look at what protections and what shields are in place, if you will, to block out the attackers. Because the goal from an IT provider, for an IT provider, is to really go in there and mitigate the losses, kind of stop the leak from happening, and then deal with damage control after the fact. Likely you'll want to work with your insurer as well. Insurers, if there's cyber coverage in the policy, they will involve an IT forensic company to come in and help recover data, help assist with plugging holes and dealing with any issues that are in the environment. And then, of course, working with your legal counsel is one that IT will often get involved in, because there's going to be that work, as I'm sure was mentioned earlier, about the privacy commissioner and notifying the affected parties. So that's kind of all from the reactive front. But looking at the preventative measures, that's really, where we got to focus a lot of our efforts on. Step one really is about cybersecurity awareness training. So there are services out there, affordable services out there that are available to educate all the staff for the condo corporation, whether it's property manager, whether it's security staff at the front desk who also have access to the network, in many cases, on just basic do's and don'ts related to the cyber world out there. Updating your operating systems and ensuring that all the firmware on all computers and devices that reside on the network are up to date is really critical as well. Going back to basics, make sure you have antivirus on your devices. Any anti-malware is really a more sophisticated version of virus, because viruses are just simple strings, but anti-malware is like a little program that resides in the computer that really infects it, and that's how this encryption takes place by the criminals. Put patch management. So if you work with an IT company, they will put remote management on each computer, and that will automatically patch the computers. That'll automatically make sure that the antivirus, anti-malware is up to date and regularly scanning. Also, the property management and condo corporations should really have a good look at the physical network at the building. So have a look, see how old the router is it up to date? Are there devices that are plugged into the network that shouldn't be there? Sniffers, is it accessible to the network? Is the internal network separate from the guest network at the building? A lot of times buildings will have Wi-Fi all throughout, and sometimes it's provided by ISPs, sometimes it's provided by the condo corporation with their access points. But you can actually segregate all guest traffic so that it's independent. So it's important to keep that separate. A lot of cybercrime gets flow through email security. It gets flow through your emails. So if there's I think it's a lot of the awareness needs to be kind of made around email security. An email comes in from a spoofed email address. It looks like a legitimate email. There's a little attachment on there. It might be 2 kilobytes or measured in bytes. If you see something like that, you should always run it through a scanner or avoid opening it, because that executable file will often infect your computer. With email, it's gotten a lot more sophisticated over the years. We have great services out there like Gmail by Google. We have Microsoft with their 365 products. And with those services, for example, they have a lot of security add-ons that you can layer on. So all inbound emails to the email accounts can go through scanners inherently and can filter out any malicious email before it even hits your inbox. There's also features that you can turn on such that PII, so personally identifiable information, such as credit card information, SIN numbers, addresses, you can actually set parameters around that, but you can actually block that information from going into your email server so that it protects the person sending it. When they shouldn't be emailing that information, it'll actually stop it and kick it back to them. And it'll alert the administrator when that occurs. I'm going to shorten this down a little bit. So securing and encrypting your data is also quite important. So all those files that are being stored on computers, Are they sitting on a third-party portal? Are they on a third-party website? Are they just on the computers? Do they sit on a server? So it's important to have a look at that environment to understand where all the data resides and how is it being secured. Is it encrypted? Do we have multi-factor authentication turned on for all of that? And most of all, at the end of the day, what's going to save the day is a regular and ongoing backups. So even if there's a cyber breach and all your data is encrypted, rather than waiting weeks and gambling on whether or not the recovery keys are going to decrypt your data, having a good backup offsite is a great tool, because then you could just restore that data, plug all the holes, and then get back to business without having to even pay the ransom half the time. As Patricia mentioned, multi-factor authentication, MFA, is a term that's often available on all of the security settings of most websites now, right down to Facebook, email, LinkedIn. Pretty much everything has either 2FA or MFA as an option. I would recommend everyone always installs MFA or 2FA, just reactivates it. And after putting in the password, it'll prompt them for a 6-digit code oftentimes. You want to have that second layer of authentication, because what happens out there is there's a dark web. So there's the internet, and then below that, it's kind of like the dark web where all the crime gets traded and where it happens. So emails and passwords get hacked off of websites and then sold on this dark web. And then you have servers out there that will basically ping these websites and try the username and password until they get in. Well, by having multi-factor authentication turned on, it'll stop the hacker from getting past the password point. So it'll protect you in that situation. And then the last thing I should probably mention on the dark web point is that there's a service out there you can subscribe to. If you have credit monitoring through Equifax or TransUnion, you can often get dark web monitoring. So it'll actually scan for credit card information, for your names, for your logins out there, and it'll give you alerts on when your information has been compromised. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, password management, I'd recommend employing a password manager as well. That's quite a mouthful, very unstructured mouthful, but if anyone has any questions on any of that stuff, I'd be happy to answer it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was very nice of you to take the time and give us some overviews. Now, do you find that with the move to the cloud and more applications in the cloud, that companies and service providers are more exposed? Or do you think that it's just something that it's always been there, but it's evolving just as people use the internet more?
I think it's ever evolving. When I say evolving, there was a time where I saw a lot of services sitting on the cloud, but there's not always MFA or 2FA enabled. You can always turn that service on, and that's as critical as having a password in the first place. Mm-hmm. The beauty of having a service in the cloud is that you're not managing it yourself on premise. So you're not responsible for patching it, making sure that the hardware's secure, making sure the network and environment's secure.
Yeah.
There's a third party dealing with it, presumably, right? So.
And so when you're looking, and let me ask you a condo director question. So how far does a condo director have to go in terms of their due diligence, do you think, these days?
So from the condo director's perspective, I think it's critical to ask these questions, right? So if the condo corporation is employing a property manager, it's important to review the agreements. From my perspective, I look at the agreements, make sure that there's protections in place. And if the agreement is old, maybe we look at modernizing and kind of getting up to date to address the cybercrime risks out there. Mm-hmm. But asking those important questions: where's your email sitting? Is it sitting on the property manager server? Is it sitting on the condo corporation server? Where's the data sitting as well, right?
Yeah, and I guess as well the use by some companies of their their email addresses or their I guess systems. How does that integrate in terms of the corporation's data being safe as well? I think that would be a consideration. If you're putting everything on somebody else's server and you don't have your own backup, that might create an exposure for the corporation.
It is, right? And the other challenge too is if you're making a switch in property management, by law they have to give you the last 7 years of data, but you're still going to have to go through the painful exercise of extracting the data from them and then dumping it somewhere onto your own server or third-party cloud services. Yeah. So it's a headache. And from a board member's perspective, I'd probably push to get that data brought back in-house under the corporation's control, mm-hmm. with the property manager as an agent accessing the data when needed.
And so would you support that periodic backup? Like, and what would it be for a condo, do you think? Would it be daily, weekly, monthly?
Yeah, it would be daily. So
daily.
And it could be as simple as putting a NAS device in the local environment, because a NAS device, you can protect it behind the firewall and within the secure network. It has multi-factor authentication turned on. And then once that daily backup is generated to the local device, just a little box about this big, and it can automatically push to the cloud, to a secure encrypted connection to the cloud. So you have 2 layers of backups.
Oh, okay. So that's good to know. And so, because the cloud makes me a little nervous, as well as subcontracting, because, you know, we know of events in the condo industry where a property management company entrusted its data to another party, who entrusted it to another party, and that party got ransomwared. And you know, all the way up the chain, everybody was being asked for money. And any thoughts on protection that far out of the circle, and any considerations for board members on that?
So in terms of, and going back to the data itself, so you have to ask yourself, well, what's the data even, right? Is it email data? Are these files? There's a lot of files that flow through a property manager's desk digitally. So long as a NAS device and the cloud backup is being managed sort of on behalf of the corporation, and it's all in the corporation's name, they have access and they have the authority to access it. The third party, I mean, that's going to boil down to the agreements that are set out by the services. So it's tricky.
So exactly. Because we only heard about the multiple layers behind the property management company after the fact. And that's when everybody said, so do you have insurance? And nobody had insurance. And, you know, with the final party in the outer ring, you know, they were so impacted by this, I think they went bankrupt from the whole event. So thank you very much, Jordan. I don't think the discussion is going to end here. We may have to go further and go a little bit deeper with you at another time. But thank you again for making the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Anytime. So if we could move to the next slide. I don't know if we have any Q&A right now, but if you come up with questions, always email us and we can definitely try to answer those after the fact. Next slide, please. And just so you know, there are Canadian Condominium Institute events coming up. Golden Horseshoe has their enhanced director's virtual course, part 4 of 8 on July 11th. Golden Horseshoe is also doing part 5 of 8 on August 8th. They want to make you work this summer. And Golden Horseshoe, very exciting in-person conference, Clawing Our Way Out, which will be held in Oakville, September 16th. Golden Horseshoe seems to be really busy. They've also got their annual general meeting in Burlington, October 19th. Huronia, a big shout out to Huronia. I tend to like them. They have their annual general meeting in September as well, and we hope to see you there. And we're having our luncheon. It's a luncheon webinar, September 23rd. And the topics are going to be posted on our website in Huronia. We have some exciting discussions going on about affordability, inflation, how to manage that reserve fund as the economy shifts, some of the things that Shannon had alluded to. So thank you all, Ashley, Julia, Shannon, Jordan, for being here today and talking to us a bit more about the dark side of condos in the cybercrime realm. And we look forward to seeing you at our next CondoWise event. Thanks again. Have a good afternoon. Thanks again, Jordan. I appreciate you being with us. That was really very helpful. Pretty practical, technical pieces right there.
Yeah, I know it was a mouthful.
I can see why you could talk about it though all day.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you think then doing third party, like having a security company do an assessment from a, internet or a technology perspective is a good idea for not just the condos, but more for service providers? Are you seeing that more in the industry?
So, yeah, I am. And even we're an MSP. So we're a provider of IT services, and we're actually renewing our SOC 2 compliance and ISO certification. So from that end, we actually need to get audited ourselves by a third-party IT auditing firm. I think it'd be a great idea for property management to work with any IT firm. There are some out there that specialize in these sort of audits.